Hi folks, my name is Dr. Scott Valentine and I'm with KPMG in Australia. It's my pleasure to be serving as host for this video series entitled Insights into Empowering the Great Energy Transition. As the title suggests, this is based on the content from a book that was published by Columbia University Press recently and co-authored by myself, along with Professor Marilyn Brown from the Georgia Institute of Technology and Professor Benjamin Sovacool from the University of Sussex. On behalf of my co-authors, I hope that you enjoy the series, that you find the content to be thought-provoking, and that you will be encouraged to take up arms and to help us to expedite a transition away from fossil fuel energy sources. When it comes to climate change, the meter is ticking, and we simply cannot afford to continue on with our dependence on fossil fuel energy systems. Hope you enjoy the journey. In the 1960s, American folk singer Bob Dylan penned the lyrics to a song entitled "Times They Are A-Changing." Although he was writing about social change in the 1960s, his lyrics are as salient to today's challenge of mitigating the perils of progressive climate change as they were to his social theme. Although there are a number of factors that are engendering a shift away from fossil fuel energy systems, climate change is the granddaddy of all tipping points. As Dylan's song reminds us, in admitting that the waters around us have grown, we better start swimming or sink like a stone. The times, indeed, are a-changing. On the surface, if you looked at trends in energy consumption over the past 25 years, you could be excused for questioning whether times are changing. This chart of annual energy consumption since 1992 indicates that the use of fossil fuels in the energy sector has actually increased. Oil in green, natural gas in red, and coal in gray have not diminished in importance. Quite the contrary, we are headed the wrong way. But as you'll see, when we look beneath the surface, we will see a different picture. I'm about to introduce you to 10 trends that together suggest that a transition away from fossil fuel energy systems is not only underway, it's now unstoppable. Ready to get started? The first trend underpinning market change is fossil fuel price inflation. It should not take a rocket scientist to realize that fossil fuels are finite resources. They're being drawn down at historically unprecedented levels, and this is producing conditions of scarcity. The chart here shows reserve to production ratios for oil, natural gas, and coal. In short, this refers to how much of a known reserve exists for a given commodity, and how much of that commodity is extracted from the reserves each year. It indicates how many years these reserves will last if we continue to produce at a given rate. As you can see by the column to the far right, if production continues to grow at the same rate it has grown over the past 25 years, 2.3%, our known reserves will be depleted in under 35 years for oil and gas, and in 54 years for coal. Any economist worth his or her salt will tell you that increased scarcity of a commodity, combined with increased demand, will lead to price inflation. So the imminent threat is not really running out of these resources, but rather what happens to the cost of these resources as we run out. Critics to reserve to production ratios will argue that the fossil fuel industry continues to discover new reserves. So, supply increases have kept pace with demand increases. Indeed, as the chart on the lower left indicates, since 1995, oil reserves have increased by 51%, and natural gas reserves have increased by 61%. So there's nothing to worry about, right? Not exactly. You see, if you look at the increase in coal reserves since 1995, you'll see that reserves of coal, which have been the historical backbone to our global energy generation infrastructure, have not really changed at all. In other words, to quote a U2 song, we're running to stand still. Even if fossil fuel companies can continue to discover new resources, to expand supply, continued increases in energy demand over even the next 20 years will force fossil fuel exploration companies to ramp up their games. They'll have to move into more remote locations, undertake more deep sea drilling, operate in less hospitable environments, and the end result will be an increase in the cost per kilowatt hour of discovering new resources. In other words, in our finite ecosystem, fossil fuel reserves will become increasingly more expensive to unearth, and then, if demand continues, they'll simply run out. So let's just see if this economic theory applied to finite commodities is supported by statistical evidence. This chart shows oil prices since the turn of the century. Ignore the severe peaks and troughs for a minute and just focus on average price changes as indicated by the black trend line. We see that over time, oil prices have progressively increased from just under $40 a barrel to just over $80 a barrel. As I record this video, the world economy is in paralysis as a result of COVID-19, and the price of oil has crashed, currently trading at $30 a barrel. But as we cover under the next trend, these short-term price blips do not reflect medium to long-term price trends. Price trends over the same period in regard to natural gas prices seem to contradict economic scarcity theory. Natural gas prices have not increased as scarcity theory would predict. Rather, on average, natural gas prices have actually dipped slightly since the turn of the century. Why is this? Beginning in 2005, horizontal drilling technologies began to uncover new reserves. A few years later, huge shale gas pockets were discovered, resulting in a flat cost profile over the last 10 years. But U.S. shale gas reserves are severely limited, and they are running out. As we will soon see, the economic law of scarcity is like the tax office. It cannot be ignored forever, and eventually you have to pay the piper. Let's turn to coal. Now remember the reserve to production ratio for coal? New discoveries were just keeping pace with amplified demand, resulting in a stable reserve to production ratio. So we should see evidence of stable prices at best and slight price inflation at worst, right? Sure enough, looking at price trends since the 1970s, we see that the cost of coal on a per BTU basis has more than doubled. And the future promises to deliver a similar forecast, cloudy with occasional inflationary periods. The International Energy Agency is a global body that was formed by the world's major economies in the 1970s to help coordinate global energy policy so as to avoid severe price shocks. Essentially then, its job is to scrutinize market data and predict market trends. Here's what they see in the fossil fuel industry going forward. Even under a scenario where nations deliver on their Paris Accord commitments, by 2040, fossil fuel energy prices will be amplified. Only in the case of a massive global transition away from fossil fuels, the Sustainable Development scenario to the right, do we see fossil fuel prices in check, and that's simply because consumers will have gotten into their EVs and headed off to see their wind farm investments in action. The amplification of fossil fuel prices has forced governments and industry to rethink energy mixes. Simply put, fossil fuels have lost their economic appeal. Indeed, our next trend suggests that fossil fuels are more akin to a visit from undesirable distant relatives than they are to liaisons with close friends. You may have noticed that the price trends of coal, oil, and gas all exhibit dips and dives, not unlike some of the world's most fearsome roller coasters. Unexpected peaks followed by sudden crashes, interspersed by brief periods of stability. That's how the game is playing out. Take oil, for example. Between 1900 and 1970, the price of oil exhibited a high degree of stability, selling for between $15 and $25 per barrel. But since the 1970 oil crises, oil prices have become bipolar. One year, high, next year, low. In many ways, price volatility is a bigger threat to industry than price inflation. Price inflation at least permits firms to make long-term investment decisions and adopt new energy efficiency technologies. But price volatility throws annual operating costs into utter chaos. This means that large energy users have to hedge their bets in costly commodity futures markets. Hedging bets in this way comes at an additional operating cost. One way stability can be enforced on volatile markets is to diversify dependence on the volatile commodity. This leads us to our third trend. Global market crises and recent disasters have made it clear to policymakers that our reliance on oil in transportation and coal in electricity generation has hired high energy risks. Consider the oil crises of the 1970s, which bankrupted many firms. Or in more recent times, consider what the Fukushima nuclear disaster did to Japanese fiscal policy. It's been almost a decade since the disaster, and the Japanese government is still trying to claw its way out of a fiscal hole. Governments around the world are beginning to diversify energy mixes, and this means moving away from the imbalance characterized by an over-reliance on fossil fuels. Another incentive for diversifying away from oil and natural gas relates largely to geopolitics. Many oil and natural gas powerhouse nations are characterized by either weak or despotic governments. The result is OECD leaders are beginning to realize that oil and natural gas purchases from politically unstable nations perpetuates all sorts of human tragedy, ranging from human rights abuses to support for terrorism. Writer Thomas Friedman refers to the link between oil profits and authoritarian regimes as the first law of petropolitics. As the price of oil goes up, he says, the pace of freedom goes down. As former CIA Director Jim Woolsey summarized, we are funding the rope for the hanging of ourselves. The term negative externality has been used by environmental economists for decades, but it's rarely found its way fully into the cost-benefit assessment of energy investments. The logic of including negative externalities into the cost of a product that produces them should be obvious. In order to assess the commercial attractiveness of any energy system, one must include both the cost of generating energy with that technology and the environmental and health costs associated with using that technology, which the government often foots the bills for through taxes. Increasingly, nations are beginning to realize that a switch away from fossil fuel technologies can also mitigate the health and environmental costs associated with combusting fossil fuels. In both developed and developing countries, these negative externalities can be significant, and so, when these costs are factored back into the cost of using fossil fuels, the allure of fossil fuels fades. The largest negative externality is significant enough to isolate treatment as a separate trend. From the denialism of the 1990s, policymakers, with the exception of a few extreme boneheads, have now seen firsthand the costs associated with early stages of climatic disaster associated with global warming. Consider just the costs of extreme weather damage in the United States. The U.S. experienced 218 extreme weather events between 1980 and 2017, incurring total costs of $1.3 trillion. In 2017 alone, the total bill for 16 extreme weather events was $308 billion, again, just in the United States. When you give a typical politician a choice between doing nothing or incurring a cost today to offset a greater cost in the distant future when they're no longer in power, most politicians will normally embrace the do-nothing option as if it were a baby at a fundraising gala. However, as fiscal budgets become impacted by extreme climatic events and voters find themselves dealing with personal disasters in the aftermath of such events, the do-nothing option quickly loses its appeal, even for a politician. Now, these first 6 trends suggest that there might also be growing support for expansion of nuclear power capacity. As a testament to this, in 2008, the World Nuclear Association projected that installed nuclear capacity would grow between 38% and 208% by 2030. In 2009, the International Atomic Energy Agency reported that more than 60 countries were investing in the adoption of nuclear power. These were heady days if you were in the nuclear industry. But then on May 11, 2001, the nuclear renaissance came to a screeching halt following the disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power complex. Aside from a few holdout nations such as China, South Korea, and India, most other leaders of nuclear-powered nations have backed away from nuclear power as if they've encountered a rattlesnake in a cave. As a consequence, major nuclear technology providers such as Westinghouse, Toshiba, and Areva are teetering on the brink of insolvency. Perhaps more to the point regarding the demise of nuclear power, it's a technology that relies on yet another finite energy source, and it's currently too expensive for most nations to consider seriously. In the world of energy policy, price rules the roost, and nuclear clearly has no place in most energy nests. While the fossil fuel industry is grappling with rising commodity costs, the renewable energy sector is experiencing heady days of falling cost profiles. Remember when the argument used to be that renewable energy is simply too expensive for nations to embrace? No longer, friend. Consider this table of levelized costs of major energy technologies from 2016. Notice the 3 cheapest forms of energy? Both wind and solar PV have delivered energy at the lowest cost per megawatt hour since at least 2016. The better news is that cost profiles for wind and solar PV continue to decline, while fossil fuel prices escalate. The costs of fossil fuel energy are headed north, while the costs of many renewable technologies are headed south. Unfortunately for the Exxons and Chevrons of the world, no one lives in the north. All of this would mean nothing if governments around the world continued to subsidize fossil fuels and create market imbalances. Policymakers have historically subsidized fossil fuel technologies in a big way, and this has created artificial market imbalances. As recently as 2008, the bulk of energy subsidies were still being directed to the fossil fuel industry despite climate change concerns. As the embedded chart suggests, though, this has all changed. The majority of nations around the world have embraced proactive policies to support renewable energy. Newfound consistency of policy support is sending positive signals to the investment sector, and this is resulting in a vibrant expansion of investment in renewable energy. Now, as the chart here indicates, investment in renewable energy has been on the rise since 2007. Indeed, for 8 consecutive years, investment in renewable energy technologies has exceeded investment in fossil fuel technologies. Investors thrive on clear market signals, and it's very clear to the bulk of energy investment firms that renewable energy is here to stay. A report commissioned by the German government concluded that the size of the global market for environmentally friendly power generation and storage was approximately €313 in 2011 and would exceed €1 trillion by 2025. As you can see, another report looking at the clean tech sector estimates €4 trillion in sales by 2025. With an expanding market like this, it becomes obvious to national economic planners that aggressively supporting domestic renewable energy firms can give rise to profitable global powerhouses, the kind that pay high taxes and ensure high-quality employment. Barack Obama said it best in 2015. For decades, we've been told that it doesn't make economic sense to switch to renewable energy, he said. Today, that's no longer true. Solar isn't just for the green crowd anymore, it's for the green eyeshade crowd too. Consider the table of leading wind turbine manufacturers here. With the exception of GE, all of these are from nations that have had world-leading wind power support policies in place, engendering the rise of domestic wind power powerhouses. There are analysts who contend that there are still powerful opponents to renewable energy in the world, and some of these opponents have the power to derail progress. Fortunately, as the trends in this episode have suggested, this concern is unfounded. Those in powerful places who lack the intellectual capacity to perceive the obvious when it's presented to them can obviously slow down progress. But at the end of the day, they're mere speed bumps on the road to a far different future. To conclude, a transition to renewable energy is inevitable. The question is, can we begin to adopt policies and practices designed to mitigate some of the barriers that are slowing down this transition? After all, if our future is inevitably going to be one that's powered by renewable energy, doesn't it make sense to embrace policies and practices to expedite the transition in a way to avoid the worst perils attributed to progressive climate change? This is what empowering the great energy transition is all about. In subsequent episodes, we'll be looking at barriers which are slowing down the transition and considering strategies for expediting change. Join us because you too have a role to play.